The economy is growing. That's what the headlines say. Jobs are being created. Markets are up. Numbers look positive. And yet, life feels harder. The same job, the same effort, but less breathing room. Groceries cost more. Rent keeps climbing. Healthcare feels heavier. And somehow, it feels like you're always catching up. This creates a quiet question people rarely say out loud. If the economy is doing well, why don't I feel it? This explainer is not about blame, and it's not about panic. It's about understanding why economic growth no longer feels like personal progress.
So to really get to the bottom of this feeling, we need to look at it from a few different angles. First, we're going to start by peeling back the layers on this idea of economic growth itself. Then, we'll trace where the money is really going by looking at the high cost of essentials. And we'll dig into why wages just haven't kept pace. From there, we'll uncover this growing split between two totally different economies, explore the psychology of what it feels like to be squeezed, and finally, we'll land on what feels to so many people like a broken promise at the very heart of it all.
All right, so let's jump into that first piece of the puzzle, this strange disconnect between the economy we're always hearing about in the news and the one that we're actually living day to day. This really is the central question, isn't it? And it's a completely valid one. If you've ever felt a little bit gaslit by all the positive economic news, you're definitely not alone. The problem, as it turns out, often comes down to the way we talk about the numbers, specifically the huge difference between an average and the middle.
Okay, so this slide gets right to the core of the illusion. You see, national numbers like GDP per capita, they're just averages. Think about it like this. If a billionaire walks into a room with 10 other people, the average wealth in that room just went through the roof. But did anybody else in the room actually get any richer? Of course not. The median person, the one standing right in the middle, is completely unaffected. And that's pretty much what's been happening to the whole economy. The average is getting pulled way up by incredible gains at the very top, while the median household has just been trying to keep its head above water.
And this isn't some new thing that just started. This chart shows us that for decades, the total economic pie, that's the higher bar, the GDP per household, has been growing steadily. But now, look at that much smaller bar right next to it. That's the income for the actual household smack in the middle. In comparison, it's been nearly flat. That growing canyon between those two lines, that's where all the frustration is. It's a visual proof that the country's economic growth just isn't making its way down to most families.
So, income for the typical household is basically stuck. But believe it or not, that's only half of the story. The other half is what's been happening to the cost of the absolute cornerstones of a middle-class life. Because while income has been flat, those costs have been rising at a truly staggering rate, pretty much eating up any little gains that people might have made.
Let's start with the big one, housing. It's the largest expense for most families. After you adjust for inflation, the price of a typical home has shot up by 250%. Our paychecks haven't come anywhere close to keeping up with that. It means that for millions of people, the dream of owning a home is just getting pushed further and further away.
And then there's education, what's supposed to be the main path to a better life. The cost there has ballooned by over 200%. What used to be a stepping stone has now become a massive anchor of debt, something that can follow you around for decades and eat up your income before you even have a chance to get started.
And finally, healthcare. Even after you account for inflation, the cost of medical services has soared by more than 150%. Now, these three things, housing, education, and healthcare, these are not luxuries. They're not optional extras. They are the absolute foundation of a secure life. And as they gobble up a bigger and bigger piece of the pie, they pretty much cancel out any small raise you might have gotten.
So while the cost of essentials is pulling more and more money out of your pocket, there's another major pressure point, the money coming in. Your paycheck. It just isn't keeping up with the actual value you're creating at work. This is what's known as the Great Wage Slowdown.
This chart, wow, it shows a massive split. You see, since the early 70s, workers have gotten way more productive. Look at that bar on the left. Thanks to new technology and just being more efficient, the value we create per hour of work has jumped by almost 75%. Now look at the bar on the right. That's median pay. It's only gone up by about 12%. It just raises this huge question. Where did the rest of that value go? We know it didn't end up in the paychecks of most working people.
And the crazy thing is, it didn't used to be this way. Not at all. In the decades after World War II, there was a kind of unwritten promise in the economy. As the country gets richer, you get richer too. And for a long time, it was true. Productivity and pay, they grew hand in hand. If you worked harder and smarter, your family actually saw the benefits. But then, right around 1973, that link just broke. Productivity kept on climbing, but the reward stopped being shared so broadly.
And this all leads us to a really fundamental shift in how wealth is even created in the first place. Right now, we basically have two separate economies running side by side. One for people who make their money by working for it, and a whole different one for people who make money by owning things.
The numbers on this slide are just stark. I mean, look at the real inflation-adjusted growth over the last 50 years or so. The median hourly wage has grown by less than 10%. In that exact same period, the stock market has exploded by 700%, and house prices by 250%. The math is just brutal. If your wealth comes mainly from your paycheck, you are on a completely different and much, much slower track than someone whose wealth comes from owning assets like stocks or real estate. This quote just captures that feeling perfectly. You're working harder, you're running faster, but it feels like the ground underneath you is moving in the opposite direction. And the real irony here is that those booming economies the headlines love to celebrate, they often make this feeling even worse. Because that's when asset prices, the stocks and the houses that you don't own, pull away the fastest.
So far, we've mostly been looking at the numbers, but we all know that this financial squeeze is also a really deep psychological experience. So let's talk about why the pressure can feel even more intense than your bank account might suggest.
One of the key reasons is a concept called loss aversion. It's this funny quirk in our brains where we feel the pain of a loss about twice as strongly as we feel the pleasure of a gain. So when your health insurance premium doubles, that feels like a huge, painful loss. The fact that your streaming service or a new pair of jeans got a little cheaper, it doesn't even come close to making up for that feeling of lost security. The big, essential costs feel like major losses, and they just psychologically overwhelm all the small wins. Another huge source of this background stress is the transfer of risk. You know, a generation or so ago, retirement security looked something like this. Most of the risk was on the company. They promised you what was called a defined benefit, a guaranteed pension check every single month for the rest of your life. It was a stable floor of security. Well, today, that picture has completely flipped on its head. The vast majority of retirement savings is now in what's called defined contribution, like a 401k. Now, that sounds fine, but what it really means is that all of the risk, the market going up and down, the fear of outliving your savings, all of it has been transferred from the institution directly onto your shoulders. And that is a huge, quiet psychological weight that our parents and grandparents just didn't have to carry. So when you start to put all these pieces together, the illusion created by averages, the soaring cost of essentials, stagnant wages, the huge gap between assets and labor, and this massive transfer of risk, it really starts to paint a picture of a fundamentally broken promise in our economy. This metaphor really says it all, doesn't it? The middle class used to stand on a pretty solid floor of stable housing costs, affordable education, and guaranteed pensions. Now that floor is gone. It's been replaced by a treadmill, where you have to work harder, run faster, and take on way more debt and more risk just to stay in the exact same place. The economy didn't break down in some huge, spectacular crash. It was much quieter than that. It just changed. The internal wiring that used to connect hard work to getting ahead, productivity to pay, and national growth to your family's prosperity, it's become frayed. The system quietly stopped delivering on the promise that effort would lead to a better life. Look, understanding all these dynamics, it doesn't pay the bills, and it doesn't make a down payment suddenly appear. But what it can do is replace self-blame with clarity. It shows that this feeling of being squeezed isn't some kind of personal failure. It's a completely rational response to a real structural shift in the way our economy works.
And just a final, important reminder. This analysis is purely for educational purposes, just to help make sense of the economic landscape. It is not financial advice.